The morning sun hadn't even risen when the phone rang. Steve Wolf stumbled to the receiver, his heart pounding. It was the Colonel, Elvis Presley's manager, and his voice was a mix of excitement and urgency. "We need to talk," he said, and Steve knew this was no ordinary call. Less than an hour later, Steve and his partner, Jim Rismiller, found themselves crammed into a small, cluttered bedroom office in Los Angeles. The room was a chaotic mix of old furniture and stacks of papers, but the Colonel was anything but disorganized. He was a force of nature, and he had a deal that could change their lives. "We were going through our speech, and he was going through his press clippings," Jim recalled later. "He was reading, saying 300,000 this, 400,000 that, and passing the clippings to us as we talked. The more he showed us, the more excited we were getting." The Colonel, with his slicked-back hair and sharp suit, didn't waste any time. He laid out his proposal, a closed-circuit show featuring Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. The scale was enormous. They were to give Elvis $1 million, plus cover the production costs, which would be around 100,000 more. It was a staggering amount, but the Colonel's confidence was infectious. "We were prepared to negotiate," Steve said, but the Colonel wasn't playing games. He gave us the deal he had in mind, and that was it. Take it or leave it. He threw it out so fast we had to keep asking him over and over, and he kept saying, "I told you boys now for the last time, this is the deal. He really hits you. You're almost sorry you asked." Steve and Jim were caught off guard, but they couldn't let this opportunity slip away. They took the deal back to their bosses at Filmways, and the reaction was immediate. The scale was so large, Steve remembered. The logistics of the thing were staggering. They fell off their chairs. A second meeting was set up, and this time the room was even more crowded. The Colonel's secretary, Jim O'Brien, was there, along with George Parkhill from RCA, the two nervous Filmways executives, and the Colonel himself. They handed over a check for $110,000, which was 1/10 of the guarantee, the deposit the Colonel had demanded. The stakes were high, and the pressure was intense. Less than a week later, Steve and Jim were called to another meeting. This time they were joined by Irving Kahn, the president of Teleprompter, the company that would provide the closed-circuit equipment. The meeting took place in the Colonel's MGM office kitchen, a place they jokingly called the cookhouse. The atmosphere was tense, but the Colonel and Kahn seemed to be enjoying each other's company, exchanging flattery and banter. But when they got down to business, Kahn suggested something that made Steve and Jim's heads spin. He wanted to send the show to Japan and Europe, via Telstar. It was a bold idea, and Steve and Jim, though bewildered, agreed to everything discussed. They knew this was bigger than they could have ever imagined. After Kahn left, the Colonel took Steve and Jim aside. He didn't tell them what to do, but he gave them advice that they knew they had to write down. "If I were you," he said, and that was when they knew they had to pay attention. The Colonel also made it clear that the advertising would focus on Elvis, not on them. "Let's get it straight who we're promoting here, Elvis or you." The Colonel's attention to detail was meticulous. He advised them not to accept collect calls from local promoters, saying, "If they can't pay for the call, you don't want them." He even picked the date for the announcement, saying, "I'll have the boy there and we'll do it right." The deal seemed to be moving forward, but then things started to unravel. On March 19th, the Los Angeles Times published a story about the project. Steve and Jim were tight-lipped when asked about the leak, but it was clear the Colonel was furious. Filmways made additional demands, and the Colonel refused to budge. The project was put on hold, and eventually it was too late to organize. Despite the setback, the Colonel's influence was everywhere. In Las Vegas, the International Hotel was buzzing with excitement as Elvis prepared for his next engagement. The hotel was decked out with Elvis Presley flags, scarves, and posters. Fans lined up at the reservation desk, and the showroom was sold out for weeks in advance. A 40-man camera crew from MGM was filming a documentary, capturing every moment of Elvis's return to the stage. Elvis had a new orchestra leader, Joe Garcio, who was initially unimpressed but quickly became a fan. "I've been on stage with a lot of stars," Joe said, "but they have no idea what a star is. Elvis was a happening, and what he had going will never be again. the Colonel's vision was clear. He wanted Elvis to be bigger than anyone else, and he was willing to take risks to make it happen. As the summer of 1970 approached, the stage was set for Elvis to conquer the rest of the North American continent. The Colonel had a plan, and nothing was going to stop him. Elvis's first tour in 1970 was a big deal. It was like he was testing the waters, seeing how things would go. The concerts were spread out in different cities: Phoenix, St. Louis, Detroit, Miami, Tampa, and Mobile. Elvis was a bit worried about the crowds, but everyone else was more worried about making sure everything ran smoothly. They didn't need to worry about the crowds, though. The tickets sold out super fast, and it was clear that people still loved Elvis. The tour was a bit messy at first. Joe Garcia, the orchestra leader, remembered it as pretty disorganized. They were traveling in a small, old airplane they called Greyhound Airlines. The band had to pick up new musicians in each city, which made things tricky. Joe Mescal, who led the gospel quartet the Imperials, said they didn't even realize they needed an announcer until they were on the road. But despite all the chaos, the shows were electric. When Elvis walked on stage, the crowd went wild. It was like the 1950s all over again. The auditoriums were huge, each holding at least 10,000 people. The tickets weren't cheap, but everyone was willing to pay to see Elvis. The energy was incredible. The crowd would roar, and thousands of flashbulbs would go off as people took pictures. Elvis stood center stage, arms outstretched, wearing his jeweled cape, looking like a comic book superhero come to life. Elvis loved the tour, but it was also exhausting. He was dealing with eye problems, and taking a lot of pills to stay awake, and then to sleep. His friends, like Jerry Schilling, said they all lived a fast life, working long hours and staying in hotels. They started taking sleeping pills to help them rest, and diet pills to stay awake. Over time, they needed more and more pills to feel the effects. After the tour, Elvis was on a high. He talked excitedly about all the things he had seen and done. He even told a funny story about staying at a Holiday Inn in Mobile, because the hotel they were supposed to stay at didn't have air conditioning. He called the Holiday Inn and asked for rooms, but they were all booked because Elvis was in town. It was a story he loved to tell. A week after getting back to Memphis, Elvis flew to Nashville to record some new music. But his eye problems got worse, and the recording session was cut short. They only managed to record 4 songs. 2 of these, Snowbird and Whole Lotta Shackin' Goin' On, were included in a country album released a few months later. Back in Memphis, Elvis was on vacation. But the Colonel, his manager, was busy planning the next big thing. He was coordinating a promotional campaign for a documentary film called Elvis, That's the Way It Is. The film was supposed to come out in November, right before Elvis's second tour. The Colonel made sure everything was perfect, from the movie poster to the supply of records in the cities where Elvis would perform. The second tour was even bigger. There were 9 concerts in 7 days, mostly on the West Coast. The shows sold out almost immediately, setting new attendance records. The crowd's reaction was the same everywhere, a roar like the ocean and thousands of flashbulbs. Elvis was still the king, and his fans were ready to see him perform. Elvis's music was still popular, even though some of it was old. RCA, his record company, kept releasing albums with the same songs, just repackaged differently, but it didn't matter. Elvis's fans were loyal, and they bought everything. He was loved by rockers and rednecks alike. His shows were exciting, but he never caused trouble. He was sexy, but he wasn't threatening. The tour ended in Denver, where Elvis and his group had a wild party at a hotel. After the tour, Elvis relaxed in California, spending a lot of money on guns and cars for Christmas gifts. This led to a fight with his father, Vernon, who was worried about Elvis's spending. Elvis got angry and stormed out of the house, wearing a purple velvet suit and carrying a jeweled cane and a pistol. He drove to the airport and, for the first time, bought a ticket on a commercial airline and flew to Washington, D.C. alone. Elvis had a plan. He wanted to meet with John Finlater, the deputy U.S. narcotics director. Elvis carried a pistol everywhere and thought a federal badge would let him carry it anywhere in the country. He had his reasons, but it was a big step for someone who had always been protected and isolated from ordinary life. Elvis had another reason for wanting that federal narcotics badge. For him, the word drugs meant heroin. Jerry Schilling, who was actually the most liberal of Elvis's friends, explained how Elvis would talk to other performers in Vegas who were struggling with drug addiction. After these conversations, some of them would stop taking drugs. Elvis believed that if he had a federal badge, he could use it to scare other entertainers into quitting their drug habits. One night, Elvis checked into the American Airlines counter in Memphis. He bought a ticket and was whisked into the VIP lounge, then onto the plane without going through security. This way, he bypassed the weapon check, and his pistol wasn't discovered. He was traveling under the name John Burroughs, a name he often used for personal mail and calls. In Washington, Elvis took a taxi to the Washington Hotel. On the way, he stopped at a donut shop in a rough neighborhood. A man there recognized him and commented on his diamond rings. Elvis, always ready with a joke, pulled out his .45 and said he was going to keep those diamonds. He laughed about this story often, and his deep, hearty laugh was something his friends never forgot. At the hotel, Elvis made several calls, starting with Gerald Peters, a driver from Los Angeles. When Gerald didn't recognize the name John Burroughs, Elvis whispered, "Sir Gerald, it's me." Elvis told Gerald he was in Washington and was planning to come to Los Angeles. He changed his mind a few times, making Gerald and Jerry Schilling drive to the airport in the middle of the night to meet him. When they arrived at the airport, Elvis stepped off the plane in a purple velvet suit and a cape, with a stewardess on each arm. His face was swollen, and he was carrying a small cardboard box with a toothbrush, toothpaste, and other travel essentials. After calling a doctor to meet them at his new estate in Holmby Hills, Elvis told Jerry about a run-in with an airline ticket agent who wouldn't let him board with his gun. The pilot had to apologize and convince Elvis to come back on the plane. The next day, Elvis woke up and asked Jerry to come to Washington with him. Jerry was hesitant because he had a job at Paramount, but Elvis insisted, even offering to charter a jet. When Jerry couldn't make it, Elvis decided to go alone. Jerry made the necessary arrangements, including booking rooms at the Washington Hotel under the name Dr. John Carpenter, a character Elvis had played in a movie. Elvis's family and friends were worried when he didn't return to Memphis. They started making calls, trying to find him. Gerald was one of the many people who received a call, but he didn't know where Elvis was. On the flight to Washington, Elvis sat next to several soldiers on their way home from Vietnam. He struck up conversations and decided to write a letter to President Nixon. The letter talked about his concerns about drugs, communism, and the influence of musicians on society. He asked to meet with Nixon and told the president he was staying at the Washington Hotel under the name John Burroughs. Elvis gave Jerry the letter to proofread. After Jerry gave it a quick read, he told Elvis it was perfect. Elvis then gave $500 to a soldier for Christmas, even though it meant they wouldn't have money for tips. When they arrived in Washington at 6:30 a.m., Elvis's face was swollen from eating candy on the plane. He wanted to go to the White House immediately, but Jerry convinced him to see a doctor first. After the doctor left, Elvis called John Finlater's office to discuss the federal badge. Finlater was polite, but couldn't give Elvis a real badge. Elvis was disappointed, but didn't give up. Later, Jerry got a call, saying the president wanted to see Elvis. Elvis and his friends were met by Bud Krogh, Nixon's top enforcement officer. Krogh advised them to leave their guns in the car, except for a gold-plated Colt. .45 Elvis wanted to give to the president. When they reached the Oval Office, Nixon shook Elvis's hand and listened to his request for the federal badge. Nixon agreed and told Krogh to take care of it. Elvis was excited and brought Jerry and Sonny into the president's office. They were nervous, but Elvis teased them about it. Nixon gave Elvis a presidential button, and even remembered to give pins to Jerry and Sonny. The meeting was short, but it was a big moment for Elvis. By Christmas, things were calm at Graceland. Elvis had just finished successful tours, and was pleased with his performance in Elvis, That's the Way It Is. His albums were well received, and the highlight was receiving the federal narcotics badge from the president. On New Year's Eve, Elvis rented a nightclub in Memphis for his annual party. As he walked in, everyone greeted him, wishing him a happy new year. For Elvis, it was a year to remember. Elvis was riding high at the start of 1971. He turned 36 on January 8th, and just a week later, he He was named one of the 7 Young Men of the Year by the Junior Chambers of Commerce. It was a big deal for Elvis, who had been hesitant to accept the honor in the past. But this time he agreed, and it was the first public function he ever attended. The ceremony took place at the Municipal Auditorium, the same place where Elvis used to go for gospel sings as a teenager. His family and closest friends were there to support him. When his name was called, he walked to the podium, feeling the warmth of the applause. He adjusted his dark blue suit and touched his tinted glasses, then grabbed the microphone. I'd like you folks to know that I was the hero of the comic book. I saw movies and I was the hero of the movie. So every dream that I ever dreamed has come true 100 times, and these gentlemen over here. He looked at the other Young Men of the Year, including Ron Ziegler, who was President Nixon's press secretary. He realized that he was now in the company of some of the most influential people in the country. It was a far cry from the days when he was criticized for his performances. These type of people who care and are dedicated, you realize that it's possible they could be building the kingdom of heaven. It's not too far-fetched from reality. I'd like to say that, I learned very early in life that without a song, the day would never end. Without a song, a man ain't got a friend. Without a song. So I just keep singing the song, good night. The audience applauded as Elvis returned to his seat. His speech was perfect, summing up everything he believed in just 44 seconds. It was a moment of pride and humility. But things took a dark turn when Elvis went to Las Vegas on January 24th. A threat came the same day by phone. Someone told Sonny West, who answered the call, that a madman was planning to kill Elvis during his show. The caller said he would reveal the assassin's name for $50,000 in unmarked cash. A few hours later, a menu from the hotel showroom was found in Elvis's mail slot. His picture was defaced, and a pistol was drawn pointing to his heart. The message at the bottom read, "Guess who and where." When the local FBI agent saw the menu, he knew they had to take it seriously. Elvis was told about the threat, and he was both excited and scared. He called his cousin, Red West, and Jerry Schilling for help. Jerry flew in immediately, and together they bolstered his security. Just before the show, Elvis looked around his dressing room. "The hotels told me I don't have to do this show," he said, "but I'm going to do it. I'd rather die on stage than in bed. And I don't want any sonobitch running around afterwards saying, 'I killed Elvis Presley.' What I want you to do is if some guy shoots me, I want you to rip his fucking eyes out." Elvis stuck a Derringer into his boot and a .45 into his waistband. He put on his jeweled cape and went on stage. The show was tense, and everyone was on high alert. In the middle of the performance, a guy in the balcony yelled, "Elvis." Elvis dropped to one knee, and the security team was ready to act. But it turned out the guy just wanted Elvis to sing, "Don't Be Cruel." Elvis stood up and sang it, even though he usually didn't take requests. After the show, Elvis returned to Memphis, but he fell into a post-performance depression. He was scheduled to record new material in March, but the session lasted only one day. Elvis sounded tired, and the sessions were canceled the next day. He was diagnosed with iritis and glaucoma, and admitted to the hospital. The next session started on May 15th, and this time, Elvis wasn't there for the entire week. He recorded a rough version of the songs at the piano, and the musicians laid down the instrumental parts. Later, Elvis and the backup singers recorded the vocals, and strings were added in Hollywood. Some of the recordings were done in a more relaxed, jam-like style, like "Merry Christmas Baby" and "Don't Think Twice, It's All Right." Elvis wanted to re-record some of the songs from May, so he went back to Nashville on June 8th. The studio was chaotic, with everyone drinking and smoking. Jerry Kerrigan, the drummer, remembered it unfavorably. There were too many people, and they had no place to sit. Finally, they cleared out some of the people and brought in chairs, but the mood was still relaxed and unfocused. Despite the challenges, Elvis managed to record 35 songs, enough for 3 albums. It was a productive but hectic time, and it showed the many sides of Elvis's life, his success, his fears, and his unpredictable nature. The recording sessions were intense. For 2 nights, Elvis and the band worked hard, laying down 8 songs. Elvis was usually relaxed and easy to work with. accepting the first or second take without much fuss. But as the second night wore on, his mood changed. One of the backup singers wasn't paying attention, and Elvis flipped out. He threw a fit, threw the microphone on the floor, and stormed out, yelling, "I've run this damn song 50 times and you all still don't know your parts." Elvis's friends and staff scrambled after him, trying to calm him down. One of them called out, "Hey, E, let's go get some cheeseburgers, man. I know an all-night place that." But Elvis was already gone. The producer wrapped up the session, canceling the next day's recording. Back in Memphis, Elvis's life was anything but normal. He went to bed around 8 in the morning and woke up in the afternoon. He'd have breakfast at 5 or 6, then rent the Memphian Theater to watch movies or the Memphis Fairgrounds to ride the roller coaster 10 times in a row. For Elvis, this was his version of a normal day. He believed that fame made it impossible to go out during the day, so he did everything at night. When he wanted to buy a bunch of sports cars as Christmas gifts, the Mercedes dealership happily opened at 2 in the morning. His jeweler and costume designer were always on call, no matter the hour. Elvis's friends, or the guys, lived with him and shared his lifestyle. They took karate lessons, ate yogurt, and took the same pills as he did. They laughed when he laughed, and walked on eggshells when he was upset. Some of them would have done anything for him, even killed for him. They protected him from fans and potential threats, especially when he was on tour or performing in Las Vegas. Each of the guys had specific roles. Joe Esposito carried Elvis's checkbook and was the gatekeeper for anyone who wanted to talk to Elvis. Charlie Hodge passed him Gatorade and scarves during his performances. Lamar Fike, who sometimes ran the lights, was often the target of Elvis's jokes and pranks. One time, Lamar fell off the toilet at Graceland and got stuck between the bowl and the wall. Elvis called the fire department to help, laughing the whole time. He never let Lamar forget that incident. The other guys would compete for Elvis's attention, trying to be the #1 boy of the week. When Elvis bought one of them a new 38 with pearl grips, the others would try to get him in trouble to get a turn in the spotlight. Elvis encouraged this rivalry, knowing it kept them on their toes. Elvis's wife, Priscilla, had her own challenges. She had moved into Graceland when she was just 14, and for the first 7 years, she did everything Elvis wanted. But as she grew older, she wanted more privacy and space. She studied ballet, design, and modeling, and she began to want an identity separate from being Elvis's wife. Their daughter, Lisa Marie, was 3, and a nocturnal lifestyle didn't fit with raising a child. Elvis was protective of his family. When he saw a photographer with a telescopic lens outside their Los Angeles home, he imagined a sniper and sold the house. Priscilla redecorated their new home with the kind of furniture Elvis liked, but they often disagreed on how to raise Lisa Marie. Priscilla thought Elvis spoiled their daughter and was too generous with his money, especially when he gave gifts to strangers. Priscilla was also concerned about Elvis's health. He had frequent illnesses and took a lot of medication. When she brought it up, he got defensive or played the wounded little boy. Outside Graceland, Elvis's fame was soaring. In February 1971, he was named the world's top male singer for the 12th time by Britain's New Musical Express. In the U.S., he received the Bing Crosby Award for his outstanding creative and artistic contributions in music. He set attendance records in Las Vegas, packing in over 4,400 people for his shows, breaking fire safety laws in the process. Elvis's performances in Vegas were legendary. He walked onto the stage to the dramatic music from 2001, A Space Odyssey, and the audience went wild. He'd toss stuffed teddy bears into the crowd, causing pandemonium. He hosted parties in his penthouse, and one night, he played a prank on Joe Mescal, a member of the gospel quartet, the Imperials. Joe's wife called to say their house was burglarized, and Elvis, hearing this, called Joe back to the suite, demanding an explanation. Despite the chaos and the pressure, Elvis found moments of joy in his life. He loved making people laugh and creating unforgettable experiences, even if it meant a bit of chaos. For Elvis, life was a stage and he was always the star. Elvis's suite was buzzing with activity. Joe had just returned meekly, and Elvis was barking orders. Sonny, call the airport and get the plane warmed up. Red, get my guns, we're going home, we gon' find that sonabitch tonight. He turned to Linda Thompson, a girl he had with him, and shouted, "Darlin', get your coat. We're going on a posse." Everyone in the room was scrambling, making calls and gathering guns. Only his date, who wasn't used to Elvis's dramatic ways, stood still. Elvis suddenly noticed her and yelled, "Darlin', goodamit, get your coat." She quickly got her coat, and they all piled into a pack of white Cadillacs heading to the Bali High Motel. On the way, Elvis kept talking about the burglary. "Gotta tell your wife, Joe, that everything gonna be all right. Probably just some kid broke in, took the TV for dope." Joe finally spoke up. "It's not necessary. I appreciate your concern, E. But the police can handle it, and besides, we have a show tomorrow." But Elvis was determined. "We gon' get that sonna bitch, Joe. We gon' get him." They arrived at the motel, and Elvis, wearing a white leather coat with a mink collar and a big floppy hat, followed Joe up to his room. Joe's wife was in shock, wearing only a nightgown and curlers. Elvis hugged her and said, "Now don't you worry, I'm gonna replace everything that's been taken. I'll replace it with better than what you had." Then he went to the phone and started making calls. He called his producer, the local police, and even the FBI. After a while, Elvis seemed to lose interest. "Okay," he said at 6 in the morning. "That's it. Let's go back to the hotel." No one mentioned the incident again. Joe later said, "It was just something he did to have some fun. He wanted some excitement. He was organizing a posse. The little boy wanted to have a good time. Yet he really cared, and this was the way he showed it." Elvis was starting to get bored with his shows in Las Vegas. They were becoming predictable, and the reviews weren't great. One critic wrote, "Elvis Presley's show at the Las Vegas Hilton is sloppy, hurriedly rehearsed, uneven, mundanely lit, poorly amplified, occasionally monotonous, often silly, and haphazardly coordinated. The audience didn't seem to care, though." Undeterred, Elvis took the same show on the road. He did 14 shows in 12 days, from Minneapolis to Salt Lake City. Each show was sold out, and the total earnings were close to $1,500,000. The logistics were impressive, with nearly 50 people in his entourage, including musicians, backup singers, and sound techs. Behind the scenes, thousands more were involved, from bus drivers to ticket sellers, but there were problems. The Imperials, part of his backup chorus, wanted more money and a solo spot. Joe Mescal, their manager, approached the Colonel, who was at a roulette table. The conversation went through Tom Diskin, the Colonel's assistant, and the Colonel refused to budge. The Imperials later decided to work with Jimmy Dean instead, which hurt Elvis. The Colonel was also known for his gambling and taking food from the hotel. There were rumors about his Dutch birth and talks of selling Elvis's contract. Things got worse in November when a paternity suit hit the press. The case was dismissed, but the details of the party scene were now public, causing tension with Priscilla and the other wives. Back at Graceland after the tour, Elvis and Priscilla tried to act normal. They had a big Christmas, with thousands of blue lights and a huge tree. Elvis rented a movie theater for late-night screenings, watching action and violence movies. Priscilla, however, seemed distant, and at a party, she hinted at an affair. Elvis became depressed and started drinking. One night after Priscilla left, Elvis and his friends set up targets in the well house. They fired guns, and the well house caught fire. Elvis laughed, saying, "Oh, Daddy, let it burn, it's only money." The police came, but Elvis and his friends denied hearing anything. On New Year's Eve, Elvis and his friends had another wild night. They put on protective gear and set off fireworks, Roman candles, and cherry bombs. No one was hurt, but the air was thick with the smell of burnt fabric, and everyone's clothes were full of holes. Despite the chaos, it was just another night in the life of the king. Elvis was heartbroken when Priscilla returned from Los Angeles to share her secret. She was in love with someone else, and it hurt even more because it was Mike Stone, a friend. Elvis and Priscilla had tried to strengthen their relationship by taking karate lessons together. The instructor, Ed Parker, introduced Priscilla to Mike, who was also part Hawaiian and a karate champion. Priscilla and Mike soon began spending a lot of time together, and their relationship grew more intimate. Priscilla started sneaking letters and small packages to Mike, and they even went to fancy restaurants in Los Angeles. Despite all this, Elvis never heard a word about it until Priscilla told him. When Priscilla told Elvis she wanted a separation, he was devastated. He alternated between sulking and raging, and his friend Ed Parker saw him cry for the first time. Elvis couldn't understand why Priscilla would leave him, especially since he had given her everything she could ever want. He felt betrayed and isolated. Despite his personal turmoil, Elvis had to perform in Las Vegas just a week later. He was supposed to get his act together, but his moods were all over the place. Sometimes he was a fantastic performer, and other times the show wasn't as good. The critics had different opinions. Frank Lieberman from the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner wrote a glowing review, which made Elvis so happy that he gave Lieberman his first interview in years. However, Robert Hilburn from the Los Angeles Times was disappointed, saying Elvis was following others instead of leading. This made Elvis angry, and he never spoke to Hilburn again. Elvis's friend Joyce Bova also visited him during this time and confronted him about his drug use. She asked him why he needed drugs, if he believed in divinity. Elvis said he used pills to find silence, which he believed was necessary for new thoughts. Joyce left the next morning, feeling disappointed and thinking it was a small, dull way for their relationship to end. Priscilla moved out of their Los Angeles house on February 23, 1972, the same day Elvis closed his show at the Hilton. He had little time to rest before he had to report to MGM for his final film, a documentary called Elvis on Tour. The filmmakers, Bob Abel and Pierre Adage, had met Elvis and the Colonel backstage after one of his February shows. They were excited about making a film that would capture the real Elvis, not just his music. Elvis was initially puzzled, but became more relaxed as Abel shared his admiration for Elvis's early music and his impact on the 1950s. They agreed to talk more, and a week later, Abel and Adage were told they might have the assignment. Before going on tour, Elvis and his band rehearsed at MGM Recording Studio. They recorded 7 songs in 3 days, and then the tour began. The first stop was Buffalo, New York, where Elvis's entrance was dramatic, with a blinding flash of light and 15,000 flashbulbs going off. A woman even launched herself onto the stage, but Elvis dodged her, and she slid into the drums. This was the kind of energy and excitement they wanted to capture in the film. The tour took them through Detroit, Dayton, and then into the South, where the weather was warmer and the crowds were larger. They played in huge arenas and coliseums, and every show was sold out. The tour was intense, with 19 shows in 15 days, but Elvis's performances were always powerful. Abel and Adage worked hard to capture every moment, knowing that this film would be a lasting record of Elvis's incredible talent and stage presence. The tour was a whirlwind, and even though they had started filming in Hampton Roads on April 9th, Abel and his team still didn't have the Colonel's final approval. They decided to take no chances, and did everything they could to impress. They rehearsed during the matinee, and filmed that same night. Abel rushed the film to Hollywood, where he had it developed, and then met the Colonel the next day in Charlotte. He showed the Colonel the footage on a 16mm projector in a local auditorium, without sound. The Colonel, who had been watching them and getting reports, was confident they were doing a superb job. He admitted he had misjudged them, and gave them the go-ahead to shoot anything they wanted on stage. Abel felt honored, but knew they needed more. He asked for better access to Elvis, and the Colonel, after a moment's pause, agreed with a heavy slam of his cane. "If you deliver, I'll deliver," he said. That first night in Hampton Roads was magical. Elvis wore his iconic powder blue jumpsuit, and the performance was electrifying. Abel and his team captured most of what they needed for the film, but Abel, always a worrier, wanted more. They followed Elvis everywhere backstage, into dressing rooms, into limousines, and even onto his chartered jet. Elvis, always the gentleman, showed his politeness and good nature, especially to fans. One time, he even handled an aggressive fan with kindness, not wanting to ruin the fan's moment. Elvis's performances were intense, and after each show he would be sweating and breathing hard, surrounded by his entourage. They would fuss over him, and he would ask how the show went. Sometimes he would get a faraway look in his eyes, especially when the security wasn't good enough, and he felt he hadn't given his best. These unguarded moments were what Abel was looking for. Back in Hollywood, Abel and his team worked tirelessly. They flew the film to Los Angeles daily for processing, and editing began as soon as the tour was over. They collected old photographs and footage from the 1950s, including appearances on shows like Steve Allen Jackie Gleason, and Ed Sullivan. They even included scenes from Elvis's movies, showing him kissing his leading ladies. Initially, Elvis and the Colonel were against using these old pictures, but Jerry Schilling, who had joined the team as an assistant, convinced Elvis to reconsider. Elvis finally agreed after a heartfelt conversation with Jerry. One of the most significant moments was the 2-hour interview with Elvis, Red, Sonny, Joe, and Charlie Hodge, conducted by Pierre and Bob at MGM. The transcripts were kept secret, and even years after Elvis's death, they were still whispered about. The interview revealed a deeper, more reflective side of Elvis, and those who heard it, like Jerry Schilling and Stan Brossette, felt they learned more about Elvis in that afternoon than in years of working with him. Despite the relaxed and reflective interview and the success of the tour, Elvis was deeply affected by the end of his marriage to Priscilla. For 6 months, he wouldn't allow their wives or girlfriends around. T.G. Shepard, who worked for RCA and became close to Elvis, saw the sadness and hurt. Elvis would talk about his marriage and the importance of staying together, often warning them about the challenges of the music industry. He would say, "You don't know what's in store for you. Always take that extra few minutes to leave your home in order. Take the time with your wife, don't take her for granted." Elvis's songs began to reflect his personal struggles. Separate Ways, written by Red West, was a deeply personal song that seemed to mirror his feelings about the divorce. Other songs like You Gave Me a Mountain This Time showed a more introspective side of Elvis, a departure from the macho and teenage lovesickness of his earlier work. The Colonel, always watching, saw Elvis's struggles. He knew Elvis well and tried to keep him excited and on track. The Colonel had planned a new challenge, 4 shows at Madison Square Garden in New York, a city Elvis had never played before. Elvis was nervous, fearing the critics who had attacked him in the 1950s, but New York greeted him with affection. The nostalgia craze of the 1950s was in full swing, and many saw Elvis as a prime subject. Elvis's performances at Madison Square Garden were a triumph. He had overcome his fears and delivered, just as the Colonel had believed he would. The tour and the film were a success, but for Elvis the personal battles continued. His music and his words in the interview showed a man who was deeply hurt, but still searching for a way to connect and find peace.